And welcome to HireRight's webinar, Data-Driven Drug Testing, Removing What No Longer Delivers. We're glad that you could join us today. I am Ashley Kirchmore, an account analyst for a drug and health screening business here at HireRight, and I will be your host for this event. HireRight prepared this presentation for informational purposes only and is not intended to be a substitute for legal advice. Should you have any legal questions, please direct them to your legal counsel. Before we begin, I want to cover a few housekeeping items. We will not be providing copies of the slides today. However, we will be sending out an email tomorrow with your HRCI and SHRM credit and a link to the recorded session that you can listen to at your own convenience or share with your colleagues. If you're experiencing any audio or visual issues, please refresh the browser window by pressing F5 on your keyboard or letting us know through the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen. After the presentation, we would appreciate getting your feedback. Please take our short survey. Let us know if this session was valuable and if you have any ideas for future topics. HireRight's speaker for today is Dr. Todd Simo, HireRight's Chief Medical Officer and Senior Managing Director of Logistics and Manufacturing. You can review his bio in the speaker folder. Dr. Simo, I'd like to turn it over to you now.
Well, thank you, Ashley. So again, this is Todd Simo. Many of you have probably heard my webinars, in the past. So, what I'm really reviewing today is, kind of, lack of better words, bringing programs from, the 1980s where many of your company's drug-free workplace programs were initially developed from the 1980s into the 2020s. So, I am going to talk about the evolution of drug testing panels. So, in the beginning, there was a 5-panel drug screen, and that was pretty much all that was supported. Now, as the time's worn on, there's analytes that have been traditionally supported that really no longer need to be supported because they're really not substances of abuse anymore. And then there's emerging substances of abuse. So, what's happening, in our country as it relates to, novel substances like synthetic cannabinoids, psychedelics, bringing your program from a 5-panel test to a broader panel test. What would that look like? I'm going to talk about leveraging point-of-collection testing. I mean, point-of-collection testing has been out there for literally decades. But again, when you start looking at, the ability to, have that negative result and have that negative result quickly, there's a variety of ways that you can do that, whether it's an employer-driven program where you as the employer are the collectors, or whether you use one of the collection site networks to be able to deliver you an immediate result. Because, in this, time-space continuum, a lot of times the company that can say yes to the candidate first wins. A qualified candidate may have several resumes out there at different companies that are maybe fundamentally the same from a work-life balance and compensation perspective. Therefore, the company that's able to say, hey, Mary, we can onboard you, faster, may be the company that actually, wins that given candidate. I'm going to look across regulatory considerations as it pertains to specimen of choice, as it pertains to drug testing panel, as it pertains to point of collection tests. So there's a variety of our states, have something to say about those things. We live in a federalist system where we have several states that are able to have a certain say on what happens from a state perspective. This, I won't be talking about much about, DOT or federally regulated testing, because really the variability in the drug screening really occurs at the company level as you have your policy and test your candidates and employees, for substances abuse as it pertains to your drug-free workplace policy. And then the last part of this presentation, we will be discussing, or I'll be discussing, best practices for reconciling your screening policies with your business goals. So, I'm going to talk about speed to hire as one of the primary metrics for that, or safety as another metric. So again, we'll go through and overlay. If you're looking for speed, this is what you should do. If you're looking for safety, the fastest drug screen may not be the best drug screen for you. So from this thing, let's look at the drug testing panels. So, as I alluded to, in the introduction here, in the beginning, there was a 5-panel drug screen. This drug screen was really the panel that was born out of the federal panel that was created during the Reagan administration and propagated as part of the 1991 Omnibus Transportation Act. And that, panel was a 5-panel drug screen that looked for Delta-9 THC. And I really call it out as Delta-9 THC. It's always traditionally been called marijuana. However, with all of the different emergences of different THCs out there, like Delta-8, Delta-10, CBD, I wanted to be very clear that, what the traditional drug screens are looking for is Delta-9 THC. And, Delta-8 THC and Delta-10 THC, while sharing a lot of the same letters from a confirmation testing perspective, look completely different. Therefore, the lab is able to identify and differentiate between Delta-9 THC and something like Delta-8 THC. The next thing is cocaine, and traditionally in urine, we're looking for cocaine metabolite. And in fact, in the other specimens, we're typically looking for cocaine metabolite. We look for amphetamines, and amphetamines are both methamphetamine and amphetamine. So again, those are the two typical amphetamines within that 5-panel drug screen. Then we look for opiates. And the traditional opiates are morphine, codeine, and heroin metabolite, which is 6-monoacetylmorphine. So heroin, as a chemical, is diacetylmorphine. So it's a morphine molecule with two extra acetyl groups on it. When the morphine passes by the liver, the first acetyl group is cleaved. When it passes by the liver again, the second acetyl group is cleaved. And really, the whole reason opiates were added to that federal panel and to that 5-panel was really to look for a marker of heroin. Heroin, as we all know, is a major drug of abuse. Heroin is actually rapidly metabolized by the body to 6-acetylmorphine and then 2-morphine. So truly the marker in most cases for heroin use is actually the presence of morphine or potentially the presence of codeine. So from that perspective, that's why, so to speak, the federal government and the drug testing labs had opiates as part of that initial panel. And then the last drug of abuse on here is, phencyclidine, PCP. Again, it persists on the panel. It's one of the analytes that has a very low positive rate. That positive rate is increasing some as of late, as so to speak, marijuana, producers that aren't dispensaries, how that criminal tries to differentiate his or her product as they're selling their marijuana from the dispensary product is adding substances like methamphetamine, cocaine, and PCP. So we're seeing quite a few samples that are now, positive for both, Delta-9 THC and PCP. So that's really what's accounting for that uptick in PCP positives. But as things, evolved, companies were like, well, we want to look for other things, such as benzodiazepines. So benzodiazepines are sedatives. The traditional benzodiazepine is Valium, and benzodiazepines work on the same pathways that alcohol works on, and therefore, It's essentially like a liquor or a pill form of a martini. And in fact, when I always say when I was a real doctor and had real patients in a clinic, I had a lady come in who was deathly afraid of flying. She was going to fly, I believe, to Paris, France, and wanted a medication that could help her. So I prescribed her, 4 Valium type medicines for her trip. And after her trip came in, she was requesting a refill of that medicine because it made her feel exactly the same way as when she drank a couple of martinis, and didn't give her a hangover. So then I had to address with her why that wasn't a good idea. But again, it's the same, so to speak, pathway and very similar effects to alcohol from so to speak, a disinhibiting effect as well as sedating effects. And then there's barbiturates, and barbiturates, another sedative type drug that is widely prescribed typically for both tension and migraine headaches. Well, the panel then increased a little more, to a 9 panel. So it included everything that's in the 7 panel, but then a couple of, opioids were added. So methadone is added to the panel, as well as an opioid called propoxyphene. And then the last kind of permutation of what I call the standard urine panels is a 10 panel. And that 10 panel is everything in the 9 panel and then the addition of methaqualone. So, methaqualone, if you watch the movie The Wolf of Wall Street, has a demonstration of the enormous sedative effect that methaqualone has. And from that perspective, it was a drug that in the 80s, 70s and 80s was highly abused. But, shortly after that, as the drug screening rules were coming into place, the drug essentially kind of fell off the illicit drug testing market. So those are the traditional drugs and the traditional, so to speak, reasons they were all put into the drug screening panel. So from that perspective, there are 2 antiquated drugs on that previous slide. The first one is methaqualone. So again, it is a sedative hypnotic, has pharmacologic effects very similar to barbiturates, but far more potent. It was introduced in the 50s, but it was, discontinued in the 1980s due to its huge abuse and addictive potential. The DEA has come in and scheduled it as a Schedule 1 drug. And literally, there have been no positive tests for methaqualone, for decades. So, it's a drug that just isn't available anymore. Quest, I believe the largest drug testing lab, Quest Diagnostics, is no longer testing for it under any of its standard panels. So if you want to look for methaqualone, it is a upcharge, and it's not a small nominal upcharge for Quest. So again, it's probably a drug that if it persists on your panel, it's because your panel was created in the 1980s and it's still on there. So, I would recommend that, you look at your, so to speak, drug-free workplace program, your policy, and decide, do we really need methaqualone or not? And I'll go through the reason that you should do that, coming up after I talk about propoxyphene. So again, propoxyphene is an opioid. It was banned by the FDA in 2010 because it was causing arrhythmias in some people. So it was causing, cardiac condition, that other opioids weren't causing. Therefore, it was removed from the market. So again, it's no longer available by prescription here in the United States. And if you look over the last 5 years at the Quest Diagnostics drug testing index, you'll see that the positive rate was 0.000% when you average the last 5 years. So are there 1 or 2 positives per year over millions and millions of samples? Yes, but that number is very, very small. So therefore, your return on investment to keep that in your panel is essentially 0. And the reason I recommend, if you have a drug-free workplace panel that persists with these two drugs on that you look at removing it, because some of the newer, the new alternate specimens out there, and when I say new, both of them have been around again for decades, due to this data, they don't even test for methaqualone. They don't even test for propoxyphene. Point of collection testing generally doesn't look for these drugs just because they're not, being used and abused anymore. So if you're trying to bring your drug-free workplace policy into the 2020s, you really want to consider eliminating methaqualone and propoxyphene from your mandatory panel so that you can, potentially use oral fluid as a specimen or a point of collection test as your specimen of choice. So what are those alternate specimens? And again, I've talked about alternate specimens and really the utility of alternate specimens, for over a decade. I'm very bullish on alternate specimens, particularly oral fluid. And the panels for these are very similar to the panels that you saw in the urine standard panels, with the exception of methaqualone and propoxyphene really aren't part of it. You'll see that, hair looks for amphetamines, methamphetamines, and ecstasy-type products, MDMA and MDA. But, cocaine is actually detected, in hair, both as a parent drug as well as multiple different cocaine metabolites. It looks for delta-9 THC in the metabolite form. Again, it does look for opiates, codeine, morphine, and heroin metabolite. And, it's also a very good detector of what we call the extended opioids, or the standard opioids, which are hydrocodone, hydromorphone, oxycodone, and oxymorphone. Oral fluid, being an analog of serum, is actually a very good specimen, to detect amphetamines, is listed there. Cocaine, both in a parent drug and metabolite. Typically, all we do is look for the metabolite. Both can be available. Oral fluid does detect delta-9 THC in the parent form. So what, oral fluid is detecting is contamination of THC after you smoke or eat, a THC gummy bear. It's actually looking for that actual parent psychoactive drug. And again, that's really important if you're testing in California or Washington, because the drug-free workplace statutes there, specify, if you're going to look for, delta-9 or the presence of delta-9 THC and take derogatory employment action from a pre-employment perspective, you need to be looking for the psychoactive form of the drug, and oral fluid, does that. Again, and it detects opiates and extended opioids, typically limited to just hydrocodone and oxycodone. So again, that, there's a great deal of overlap between the standard panels available for urine as well as for hair and oral fluid, as long as you eliminate the kind of antiquated or passé analytes, which are methaqualone and propoxyphene. So if you're looking for, hey, I'd like to move forward with a, oral fluid program, moving forward with oral fluid, you would have to revise what substances you're looking for within your policy. So now let's start talking about the potential add-ons. So the first potential add-on here that can be added to any of the specimens, whether it's urine, oral fluid, or hair, is fentanyl. So I'll address the right side of this slide first. From that perspective, fentanyl, very bad drug, being, brought in from, Asia, as well as crossing the Mexican border, very, very potent. The, so to speak, people that are bringing it in illicitly aren't exact chemists, and therefore can have batches of pills that, are essentially lethal, or not essentially lethal, are lethal. And you can see, the escalation in regards to, overdose deaths during this period of time. And much of that is due to fentanyl, or fentanyl's metabolite, which is carfentanil, or a derivative, I should say, not a direct metabolite. And again, the DEA actually has a website out there called One Pill Can Kill, and I would recommend anybody with school-age children that they sit down and watch it with their children, because again, that one pill can kill, and it's really due to fentanyl. So the federal government, Human and Health Services, which has its own drug testing program of about 300,000 federal employees, none of which are representatives or senators, introduced fentanyl and its metabolite norfentanyl into the federal panel July of this year. So, in January of this year, HHS published its final rule saying we're going to start testing for fentanyl for our employees under the federal panel in July, and that has moved forward. They're testing in urine, since there's no federally approved labs for oral fluid yet. And this addition of fentanyl is just for the federal employees. So if you're part of a DOT program, it isn't for you. DOT can now add fentanyl if they do a notice of proposed rulemaking and say, hey, we want to add fentanyl to the panel. DOT has alluded to that, in all likelihood will be coming. But at this point in time, DOT is not testing for fentanyl, nor has there been a notice of proposed rulemaking to adopt fentanyl since the July date. So there's more to come from a DOT perspective. And HHS believes that the confirmed positive rate for federal testing, for fentanyl isn't going to be high. It's going to be in the, 0.1% to 0.3% range. So it's not high. That's fairly consistent with the numbers Quest has gotten as part of their drug testing index. There are other labs out there that test for it in workplace that have, the decimal point moves one to the right, where the amount of specimens they're detecting is higher. So again, fentanyl, in all likelihood, at some point will be added to the DOT panel. And if you're in an area where you're concerned of, fentanyl being one of the drugs of abuse that, your drug-free workplace program wants to deter people from using or considering to use, adding fentanyl to your overall panel, may not be a bad idea. With the HHS pushing through a fentanyl rule, the actual cost to add on fentanyl is not as high as it was a few years ago, but it is still, higher than adding like extended opioids to your panel. So again, the second add-on to consider are synthetic cannabinoids, aka spice and K2. So going into this presentation, I was really like, I don't see anybody asking about adding, synthetic cannabinoids to their panel. If I go back, 10, 15 years ago, I was getting bombarded with questions on synthetic cannabinoids. What are they? How are they being used? What is this spice stuff? Can we drug test for it? So the laboratories have all responded. The major laboratories have testing panels for it. Unfortunately, synthetic cannabinoids isn't a single drug. It's literally hundreds of different synthetic cannabinoid substances out there, all of which act through the cannabis receptors in our brain, and many of which are classified as Schedule I drugs. And there's also states that have come in and prohibited certain of these substances as well. So there's both action at the federal and state And, again, due to the lack of, so to speak, consumer demand that I saw for this, I was like, well, this may be something that if they're currently testing for it, they may not want to. So I then did a literature search. And then this is just one of many that I found that even though the use isn't substantially high, the use is actually increasing here over the last few years, that more and more people are self-reporting that they use synthetic cannabinoids. They're basically using synthetic cannabinoids to, so to speak, beat the drug test. They like cannabinoids. They know their company tests for delta-9 THC. So instead of, going to the dispensary, buying it from the drug dealer, growing it themselves, illegally, they end up, using a synthetic cannabinoid product that they get off the internet. It may be a Schedule I drug. It may not be, depending upon the manufacturer of that. But again, they use it. They have the, so to speak, marijuana effect without being able to be detected on a standard drug screen. So again, this may be something that you want to consider reintroducing as an add-on, to your drug-free workplace program. Especially if you're one of those areas where, that type of use seems to be more prevalent. So here's some urine-specific add-ons, and again, they may not be exactly urine-specific, but one of the common add-ons we have are extended opioids, again, which is hydrocodone, hydromorphone, oxycodone, and oxymorphone. And those, so to speak, extended opioids can be added. I generally, typically for most clients, don't recommend, carte blanche adding extended opioids to it. The overall positive rate, at the lab is about 0.25%. And, greater than 85% of the time, or about 85% of the time, the test gets overturned on medical review. So again, you're having some things go into further testing and take a longer period of time to ultimately get a negative drug screen. But instead of getting a negative drug screen the day after collection, you're getting a negative drug screen 5 or 6 days after the date of collection. I do strongly recommend it for healthcare positions and healthcare positions where they have access to medicines, because this is one of the ways that you can find if that doctor, that nurse, that medical assistant may be, dipping into, so to speak, the medicine cabinet and diverting drugs for their own use. Again, MDMA, MDA, ecstasy, and ecstasy analogs. Not a big, advocate for adding these to your panel. The positivity rates are exceptionally low. In fact, HHS was looking at removing MDA from the federal panel, and due to the overall low positive rate. And after they read the comments that were placed on that, they essentially kept it in, saying, well, it's already in there and it doesn't save any money to remove it, so hey, we might as well just keep MDA as part of the federal panel. Again, the overall positivity rate is extremely low. It is an additional cost to run it, and I'm not, an advocate, or so to speak, for everybody to add it as part of their normal drug-free workplace program. Again, there may be a niche need. You may want to consider it for your reasonable suspicion program, but to spend the extra dollars for your pre-employment or random testing program, I don't believe you'll get a return on investment of having it in your panel. So here's some more urine-specific add-ons, and this is really, I'll say the new synthetic cannabinoids. So, over the past, year and a half, I've gotten several inquiries in regards to, these three substances. Had a huge amount of, increase in asking about it. after the pilot that I believe was a Southwest Airlines pilot was, so to speak, flying in the jump seat and decided to turn the engines off of the plane because he was having a trip from his magic mushrooms. Again, was well covered by the media. The guy had criminal charges brought against him. Again, it's a Schedule I drug, psilocin. However, people are microdosing it now, and there's been studies at some of the research universities for use for PTSD and other psychiatric, so to speak, disorders. And, and it's had some positive effect in people. But now decriminalization is happening. It's, like I said, maybe a new marijuana where it's like, well, you can, you use marijuana. Well, why can't you use mushrooms? Why can't you use psilocin or psilocybin? So from that perspective, it's been decriminalized for medical use in Oregon, Colorado, and New Mexico. Our compliance attorney, Alonzo Martinez, has done some nice articles on this. But, again, these are really bad drugs if you're not using it under medical supervision. And, Colorado has decided, well, heck, you can grow your own, so to speak, psilocybin mushrooms in your backyard, and you can use it yourself. So again, that's causing a great deal of problems for employers in Colorado. There's no employment protections as of yet for these, but again, it's still causing people coming to work, having a psychotic episode generally isn't good for workplace safety. And again, allowing people to grow it themselves and using it certainly isn't in the intent of the rule of microdosing under strict medical supervision. The next drug, peyote, again, another Schedule I drug, so to speak, mescaline coming from a cactus. There's no widespread decriminalization for peyote, so it's not like anybody's petitioning, hey, we're going to start using peyote for PTSD in our veterans. However, there are legal protections for peyote since, Native Americans have been using it under their religious practices for centuries, and therefore you can continue to use peyote as part of those. So again, a few years back, a trucking company had some issues with peyote, within their driving force. They came to me saying, hey, can we test for this? Can we put it in a routine, pre-employment panel that we'll be doing under our own company policy? And I certainly said, you can, and it is available to be tested for. But then when I brought up the legal protections, for religious purposes on Native American territory, they essentially backed off right away and looked for it as not looking at the drug screen itself, but if someone's impaired at work, just taking normal HR action based upon that. But again, that is out there. It is available for testing, but the one caveat is there are some legal protections for, Native American religious purposes. The last drug coming from, Southeast Asia, kratom, mitragynine and 7-hydroxymitragynine. Again, it's essentially a stimulant opioid, a combination. In low doses, it does have stimulant effect. In high doses, it has more sedative and potential psychotic episode effect. And right now, the federal government hasn't made an official stance on it. So they haven't come in saying, hey, this is a Schedule I drug from a federal perspective. There are a variety of states that have banned the sale of it in their specific state. So again, is it available for testing? Yes. And if you're in an area where you may want to add it to the panel. when I look at all of these specific, psychedelic or these specific add-ons on this side, the psychedelic and kratom, these would be things that I wouldn't add to your typical pre-employment drug screen or your random program, but it would be something to consider to put on your, so to speak, for-cause testing program, your reasonable suspicion program. Because if you have someone having a psychotic episode and you do a standard 9-panel drug screen with fentanyl, add-on, you're ending up not going to detect that. You're going to end up, having a negative drug screen. So again, these are drugs to consider adding to your reasonable suspicion programs. So one add-on for oral fluid that wasn't part of the standard panels that I showed were benzodiazepines. So benzodiazepines are out there again. They work on the same neurotransmitter, the gamma aminobutyric acid, the GABA receptor, which is the same receptor alcohol works on. And again, this is out there and available, both in hair and oral fluid. So this is really, if you're looking at an oral fluid program and wanting to augment it, you can clearly augment it with benzodiazepines for those laboratory-based testing. So now let's talk about leveraging, point of, collection tests. So from that perspective, I had a whole webinar on point of collection testing before, and what it's taking is the high throughput, low complexity test that the laboratory does on every specimen that it receives, or nearly every specimen that receives, and puts it in a so to speak, a cassette device that can be read on site, can be read, right away, generally within 10 minutes of the donor providing a sample. It's available for both oral fluid and urine. And I believe nearly 100% of us on this webinar today has done an immunoassay test, because if you got those, did a COVID test 5 years ago, all of those COVID tests were immunoassay tests. So you're completely aware of how those things work and what they do. And again, the immunoassay is the highly sensitive, area, so it's able to detect, hey, is there drug there? And if the answer is no, it says, yep, it's negative. However, it's not very specific, meaning that if it does detect drug, it doesn't necessarily mean it's, detecting the drug that you want it to detect, because there is cross-reactivity. Because from that perspective, POCTs, point of collection tests, do cause false positives. And it's because molecules can look the same to an immunoassay. Therefore, a class of antidepressants the immunoassay test will say, well, this is presumptively positive for PCP. Or there's drugs that kind of sort of look like THC, that delta-9 THC, and the device will say, hey, this is positive for THC. So again, cross-reactivity and false positives. Everything you read on the internet as it relates to false positive drug screens is really talking about immunoassay technology. That's why if it is, if a specimen is positive with a point of collection testing device, that should then go through confirmation testing. So again, this is addressing the false positive issue. The confirmation test, which is really inline chromatography with mass spectrometry. Again, this is exquisite technology that essentially breaks down the molecule by mass and then by how it's molecularly configured, and each substance looks different, and therefore this is the reason the lab can say, this is delta-9 THC, it's not delta-8 THC. This is cocaine and not something else, or cocaine metabolite and not something else. So this gives a definitive result that has a quantitative level associated with it. So when you talk about false positives, you are not talking about confirmed positive tests with chromatography and mass spectrometry. So again, the basic process flow for any point of collection test is a point of collection test is collected. There's a result that's available in about 10 minutes. And if it's negative, there's no drugs are detected. If it's positive, there's potential drugs, and that needs to be then confirmed. So what specimens are supported by point of collection tests? So again, urine, as we talked about before, multiple test panels are available. However, not as many as what the lab can support. There's two basic configurations that you see here. One is a cup that you see on the bottom. The other one is a dip card you see on the top, and both are lateral flow immunoassays. Again, they're extensively the same as the immunoassay being done at the lab. The cons for any kind of point of collection test is, it's urine, and a lot of people, safety HR people, aren't comfortable, dealing with someone else's urine. It needs a clean, private, single-stall bathroom, ideally, for the collection of the specimen. And depending upon the device being used, how you get it confirmed can vary and can be more difficult. If you're looking at this cup can actually be sealed and sent to the laboratory under chain of custody to be tested. However, if you're using a dip card, as you see on the top, well, now you need potentially a whole other collection in regards to being able to have a specimen to be sealed and sent to the lab. Oral fluid. There are, again, multiple point of collection devices for oral fluid. Has multiple test panels, again, but not as many as available in urine, as well as not as many as available in laboratory-based oral fluid testing. And they come in two configurations that you see here as well. There's an inline cup that you see below, as well as a swab-only device. But again, both are using that lateral flow immunoassay to be able to give you a device. The pros of this is it's easy to collect, and you don't need any plumbing. You don't need a dedicated single-stall bathroom. The cons for it, the screening level for THC and the point of collection devices are quite a bit higher than what the laboratory supports for most of those products. There is a new product that has come to market that actually offers the same screening level as the laboratory does at 4 nanograms per milliliter, but most of the other ones are 10 to 20 to 40 nanograms per milliliter in regards to strain. And then depending upon the device, once again, how do you get that to the lab for confirmation testing? So again, when you look at, oral fluid lab-based versus point of collection, again, the lab supports a 4 nanogram per milliliter cutoff, which gives you a window of detection about 16 to 21 hours. However, with the traditional, I'll just say, point of collection devices for oral fluid, the window of detection is only 4 to 6 hours. And some people on the phone may think that's the ideal solution, because what you're trying to do is find the person who used marijuana over lunch. So therefore, this type of device gives you a window of detection that you're looking for. Again, and there is a new, I believe it's a company called N-Form that offers a test on the market that does look for delta-9 THC at 4 nanograms, just like the lab. However, when you're looking for the other major drugs of abuse, cocaine and methamphetamine, there's really no detection window difference. So again, administrative options for point of collection testing, whether it's on-site or clinic. So again, on-site, it's where you as the company are the collectors. It eliminates the collection cost. If you're doing this, for random purposes or a post-accident test, there's no lost time at work, and you have immediate knowledge of negative results. However, one of the cons is you have immediate knowledge of non-negative results. Therefore, there are states that prohibit you to use a point of collection test on your current employees. And then one of the other cons you do it administratively have to handle the result in some way and be able to get it for confirmation testing if needed. And again, there is, clinic-supported point-of-collection devices. So the one I have here is, eSpring's proprietary eCup Plus. That's at, essentially, I believe, all of their installed clinics nationwide. The clinic is able to do a point-of-collection test. But LabCorp has a technology that they call Radar. I believe CRL is coming to market with a multiple panel device as well. So there's other options that are available there. Again, the pro is highly automated. You get immediate knowledge of those negative results, and the clinic kind of handles all the administrative challenges. The cons here is, you may be in an area where none of these technologies are supported, and you do have the inherent delay of getting the donor to the collection site. So regulatory considerations. So from a panel selection perspective, the one thing that is really challenging from a panel perspective is, Delta-9 THC. So I've had complete, 1-hour talks on Delta-9 THC and state laws and how to handle it. But there are, 4 states that essentially ban testing for Delta-9 THC unless it's for reasonable suspicion. And once again, those states are Minnesota, Rhode Island, New York, and New Jersey. The rest of the jurisdictions, you can test for it, but there are a variety of laws saying, do you have to consider accommodation for a medical user? Yes or no? So there is a patchwork of laws out there as it pertains to Delta-9 THC, and therefore, there are regulatory considerations, if you're going to have THC in your panel. From a specimen perspective, urine is universally accepted. However, when you start looking at others, oral fluid right now, Hawaii's Director of Human and Health Services apparently doesn't like oral fluid as a specimen, and it's at, I believe it's a he, but it's at his discretion whether oral fluid can be used or not. So if I'm an employee or an employer that has employees in Hawaii, I would stay away from oral fluid. Again, hair is widely accepted throughout the states. However, it's typically restricted to pre-employment testing. That hair, shouldn't be used certainly for post-accident or reasonable suspicion since it has no temporal relationship to use. And again, the test reasons, pre-employment is essentially universally allowed. For-cause testing is generally universally allowed. Of course, some states have a definition of what a post-accident test or what a reasonable suspicion test is supposed to have. So there are some wrinkles there that are different, but again, it's generally universally accepted that you can do it. Random testing, on the other hand, again, there's states here, California, case law seems that random testing appears not to be reasonable. It's really restricted to safe and sensitive employees in Iowa and Massachusetts, and it's prohibited in Rhode Island and Vermont. So there are some things from a test reason perspective that you need to be aware of. And from a point of collection testing perspective, there's one state, Vermont, that doesn't allow any form of point of collection testing. Point of collection testing is also prohibited in Nevada. You may need to get a lab accreditation to be able to do it as an employer. And again, I'm not going to read through this. We do have a web page available that has this, but use is restricted to pre-employment only in those 6 states. There are point of collection testing devices that have an e-reader associated with it, like the Premier Biotech product. And once you have that e-reader, 4 states that have traditionally not allowed employer-driven point of collection testing, Kansas, Minnesota, and New York, now allow it. So again, if you have an e-reader like the Premier Biotech product, you're able to do testing in point of collection in I'll just say Kansas. And then last is the special certification is needed in Oregon. So you actually have to fill out and get a license from Oregon that I believe costs $50 per year that allows you to use a point of collection test as an employer. So best practices, reconciling your screening policy with your business goals. So there's, four business goals, here, that I really go through. One is speed to hire. As I talked about before, speed to hire is very important. People, you want to get these people hired. You want them through the screening process as fast as possible. The next is, cost. And that cost really is specimen selection. What specimen are we going to use? What panel are we going to use? Those are the two things that are really involved in that. Are you going to use point of collection testing as part of that? Because that impacts cost as well. The third is return on investment, which is really risk mitigation, right? So again, that is, impacted by your panel and specimen selection, because the higher your overall derogatory or positive rate, the greater your risk mitigation value is. And there's also program configuration. Are you going to put a random program in place as an additional deterrence measure to keep your people from potentially using drugs? And then the last thing is ease of administration. And I can't understate that. You want a program that you don't have to spend huge amount of manpower managing, right? You want to be able to kind of deploy it and have that program run. So from a speed to hire perspective, consider client administered point of collection testing, either in urine or oral fluid. You can certainly consider clinic administered point of collection testing. And two examples there, once again, are eScreen's eCup Plus. But you also have oral fluid point of collection testing being available at a variety of LabCorp patient service centers. And then, for routine testing, I recommend limiting your panel. I believe a 5-panel test is perfect for the vast majority of employers out there. When you start adding in the additional analytes, you start adding in more laboratory testing time, potentially MRO process time with, very small iterative returns on investment. So again, from a speed to hire perspective, having, that 5-panel test is probably where you want to be. Cost. Again, consider, self-collection, whether it's urine or oral fluid, laboratory-based or point of collection. I know for most people, managing a urine program isn't palatable. However, oral fluid, the donor collects the specimen on his or herself, and really the collector is there just to make sure that the donor is sticking the swab in his or her mouth and really not collecting the specimen. And again, for, cost containment, limit your panel. The broader the panel, the more expensive it is. And therefore, not only costs more time, it also costs more money. And the vast majority of drugs that you're adding to the panel generally are prescription medications in most cases. And, depending upon that, opioids have a, overturn rate in the 85 to 87% range. When you start looking at amphetamine as part of the normal panel, it's 90+% are overturned in medical review. Barbiturates are more in close to 90%. Benzodiazepines are very similar to the opioids in that 85 to 87% range. Return on investment. So again, this is a statistic I've used ever since the Obama administration propagated the data, that every time you identify and eliminate from your workforce, either through termination or rehabilitation, you're saving yourself, $14,000 per year per occurrence. So again, look at alternate specimens, because alternate specimens certainly have had a higher positive rate, lab positive rate. I've used this statistic before. 10 out of 10 people that do drugs know it. and they're able to prepare for a urine drug screen since it's not a witness collection. However, they're less able to prepare for an oral fluid or hair test. So again, that alternate specimen does give you a higher return on investment. And then, really, this is where you consider doing those add-ons, those psychedelic add-ons if you're in an area, such as Colorado, where, so to speak, psilocybin is becoming more and more of an issue. So again, adding to your reasonable suspicion or post-accident program, those additional drugs that are impairing, particularly if they're not being, overseen by a treating physician. So, the add-ons of those are, this is really the area that you want to do it, because then you can discover that use that you wouldn't find with an ordinary standard panel drug screen. From an ease of administration perspective, clinic collected urine is always the easiest. There's no state issues, and there's huge collection site networks for the most part. But you can certainly consider clinic-based, oral fluid or urine testing, because then you're putting all the administrative burden on the collection site that's used to handling those burdens, and you yourself don't need to, get involved in that. From that perspective, I know we have a couple minutes for questions. So Ashley, I'll let you do your final comments, and if you have a couple questions we can address those.
Thank you, Dr. Simo. The first question we have is, what is your favorite drug screening specimen?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think I alluded to it or stated it during the webinar, but I'm very bullish on oral fluid. And the reason I'm bullish on oral fluid is, number one, it is an analog to serum. So it's what's in your oral fluid is essentially what's in your blood at that time, with the exception of THC. But with THC, the detection window of THC is exceptionally small, generally less than 24 hours. So even if you're a daily chronic user that has extra body fat on you, you don't have this extended window of detection, that your window of detection is in that sub 24-hour range. And as I delineated in past webinars, after you smoke pot, you have a degree of impairment for greater than 24 to 36 hours. So therefore, that positive drug screen for delta-9 THC in oral fluid is really an indicator of, likely impairment, and therefore oral fluid, gives you a great specimen that's able to say what's in the person's blood at the time, as well as, being able to give some defensibility on saying the person was actually impaired in marijuana at the time we did the drug screen with that narrow detection. So it eliminates a lot of the state regulatory noise that you get with THC. So again, it's a witness collection with a high positivity rate that eliminates a lot of the state law, state regulation noise that their THC rules, put into the mix.
Thank you. The next question is, with all the controversy in regards to hair tests, do you support companies using that specimen?
Yeah, another really good question. I really didn't address the issues with hair. I mean, hair testing, there's been some lawsuits as of late where, employers that use hair have lost the test because they weren't able to defend the external contamination, caused the positive. These were highly in public service people, police officers, I want to say firefighters, so people that may be around extraordinary amount of, crack smoke as they're, so to speak, arresting people. Again, for most employment considerations, I think hair is a fine specimen. It has a very long detection window. It's more like doing a background check than a drug screen, because it does go back to potentially 90 days from time of collection. So it gives you a much broader window. It has a great deterrence effect with donors. So again, if you're an exceptionally safety-sensitive employer that is trying to mitigate any issues with your current employee base with drug-free or any of your employee base from using drugs, hair should be a consideration for you. And all you have to do is Google J.B. Hunt and hair testing, and you can see that as soon as J.B. Hunt had, all of its truck drivers have a hair test, that their random rate fell to about a quarter of what it was before hair testing. And their post-accident rate, which was very low to begin with, but was still there prior to hair testing, has been 0% year over year for several years in a row. So again, great deterrence effect. And again, I would support if you're a highly safety-sensitive employer that can't tolerate any or try to eliminate to the greatest degree possible a current employee from using hair testing is a great specimen.
Thank you, Dr. Simo. For all questions that were not answered, those will be addressed by email. We want to thank you for attending today's webinar. We will be sending out an email tomorrow with your HRCI and SHRM credits. Please don't forget to take our short survey. We're glad that you joined us today. Have a wonderful day.